Hello there, and welcome to this reading of Eclipse, the third book in the Twilight Saga by Stephanie Meyer. I'm Mad Morph, and this is Down to Sleep, my podcast where I read books and bedtime stories to you to help you get a good night's rest. Like and subscribe for more free readings right here on the second channel, or if you want to hear the whole audiobook right now, join me on Patreon. It's a few dollars a month, and you get access to every single audiobook that I've done so far. That's more than 400 episodes at patreon.com/downtosleep. Thank you for your patience with this one. At the moment I'm deciding if I should do Breaking Dawn or The Short Second Life of Britannia next, so let me know in a comment below what you think. And as always, if you want more of me, you can find the links to my other channels in the info below, including my gaming channel, my Instagram if you want to see my face, my channel where I talk about movies and TV, and of course the main podcast channel for even more free readings. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and tuck you in. Take a nice deep breath for me, and let's get down to sleep. Eclipse by Stephanie Meyer. All our attempts at subterfuge had been in vain. With ice in my heart, I watched him prepare to defend me. His intense concentration betrayed no hint of doubt, though he was outnumbered. I knew that we could expect no help. At this moment, his family was fighting for their lives just as surely as he was for ours. Would I ever learn the outcome of that other fight? Find out who the winners and the losers were? Would I live long enough for that? The odds of that didn't look so great. Black eyes, wild with their fierce craving for my death, watched for the moment when my protector's attention would be diverted. The moment when I would surely die. Somewhere, far, far away in the cold forest, a wolf howled. Bella. I don't know why you're making Charlie carry notes to Billy like we're in second grade. If I wanted to talk to you, I would answer that you made the choice here, okay? You can't have it both ways when... What part of mortal enemies is too complicated for you to... Look, I know I'm being a jerk, but there's just no way around. We can't be friends when you're spending all of your time with a bunch of... It just makes it worse when I think about you too much, so don't write anymore. Yeah, I miss you too. A lot. Doesn't change anything. Sorry. Jacob. I ran my fingers across the page, feeling the dents where he had pressed the pen to the paper so hard that it had nearly broken through. I could picture him writing this, scrawling the angry letters in his rough handwriting, slashing through line after line when the words came out wrong, maybe even snapping the pen in his too big hand. That would explain the ink splatters. I could imagine the frustration pulling his black eyebrows together and crumpling his forehead. If I'd been there, I might have laughed. Don't give yourself a brain hemorrhage, Jacob, I would have told him. Just spit it out. Laughing was the last thing I felt like doing now, as I reread the words I'd already memorized. His answer to my pleading note, passed from Charlie to Billy to him, just like second grade, as he'd pointed out. It was no surprise. I'd known the essence of what it would say before I'd opened it. What was surprising was how much each crossed-out line wounded me, as if the points of the letters had cutting edges. More than that, behind each angry beginning lurked a vast pool of hurt. Jacob's pain cut me deeper than my own. While I was pondering this, I caught the unmistakable scent of a smoking burner rising from the kitchen. In another house, the fact that someone besides myself was cooking might not be a cause for panicking. I shoved the wrinkled paper into my back pocket and ran, making it downstairs in the nick of time. The jar of spaghetti sauce Charlie had stuck in the microwave was only on its first revolution, when I yanked the door open and pulled it out. "What'd I do wrong?" Charlie demanded. "You're supposed to take the lid off first, Dad. Metal's bad for microwaves." I swiftly removed the lid as I spoke, poured half the sauce into a bowl, and then put the bowl inside the microwave and the jar back in the fridge. I fixed the time and pressed start. Charlie watched my adjustments with pursed lips. Did I get the noodles right? I looked in the pan on the stove, the source of the smell that had alerted me. "Stirring helps," I said mildly. I found a spoon and tried to declump the mushy hunk that was scalded to the bottom. Charlie sighed. "So what's all this about?" I asked him. He folded his arms across his chest and glared out the back windows into the sheeting rain. "Don't know what you're talking about," he grumbled. I was mystified. Charlie cooking? And what was with the surly attitude? Edward wasn't here yet. Usually my dad reserved this kind of behavior for my boyfriend's benefit, doing his best to illustrate the theme of unwelcome with every word and posture. Charlie's efforts were unnecessary. Edward knew exactly what my dad was thinking without the show. The word boyfriend had me chewing on the inside of my cheek with a familiar tension while I stirred. It wasn't the right word. Not at all. I need something more expressive of eternal commitment. But words like destiny and fate sounded hokey when you used them in casual conversation. Edward had another word in mind. And that word was the source of the tension I felt. It put my teeth on edge just to think it to myself. Fiancé. Ugh, I shuddered away from the thought. "Did I miss something? Since when do you make dinner?" I asked Charlie. The pasta lump bobbed in the boiling water as I poked it. Or try to make dinner, I should say. Charlie shrugged. "There's no law that says I can't cook in my own house." "You would know," I replied, grinning as I eyed the badge pinned to his leather jacket. Good one. He shrugged out of the jacket as if my glance had reminded him he still had it on. He hung it on the peg he reserved for his gear. His gun belt was already slung in place. He hadn't felt the need to wear that to the station for a few weeks. There had been no more disturbing disappearances to trouble the small town of Forks, Washington. No more sightings of the giant, mysterious wolves in the ever-rainy woods. I prodded the noodles in silence, guessing that Charlie would get around to talking about whatever was bothering him in his own time. My dad was not a man of many words, and the effort he had put into trying to orchestrate a sit-down dinner with me made it clear there were an uncharacteristic number of words on his mind. I glanced at the clock routinely, something I did every few minutes around this time. Less than a half hour to go now. Afternoons were the hardest part of my day. Ever since my former best friend and werewolf, Jacob Black, had informed on me about the motorcycle that I'd been riding on the sly. A betrayal he had devised in order to get me grounded, so that I couldn't spend time with my boyfriend and vampire, Edward Cullen. Edward had been allowed to see me only from 7 till 9:30 p.m., always inside the confines of my home and under the supervision of my dad's unfailingly crabby glare. This was an escalation from the previous, slightly less stringent grounding that I'd earned for an unexplained 3-day disappearance and 1 episode of cliff diving. Of course, I still saw Edward at school, because there wasn't anything Charlie could do about that. And then Edward spent almost every night in my room too, but Charlie wasn't precisely aware of that. Edward's ability to climb easily and silently through my second-story window was almost as useful as his ability to read Charlie's mind. Though the afternoon was the only time I spent away from Edward, it was enough to make me restless, and the hours always dragged. Still, I endured my punishment without complaining because, for one thing, I knew I'd earned it, and for another, I couldn't bear to hurt my dad by moving out now, when a much more permanent separation hovered, invisible to Charlie, so close on my horizon. My dad sat down at the table with a grunt and unfolded the damp newspaper there. Within seconds, he was clucking his tongue in disapproval. "I don't know why you read the news, Dad. It only ticks you off." He ignored me, grumbling at the paper in his hands. "This is why everyone wants to live in a small town. Ridiculous." "What have big cities done wrong now?" "Seattle's making a run for murder capital of the country. 5 unsolved homicides in the last 2 weeks. Can you imagine living like that?" "I think Phoenix is actually higher up the homicide list, Dad. I have lived like that. And I'd never come close to being a murder victim until I moved to his safe little town. In fact, I was still on several hit lists." The spoon shook in my hands, making the water tremble. "Well, you couldn't pay me enough," Charlie said. I gave up on saving dinner and settled for serving it. I had to use a steak knife to cut a portion of spaghetti for Charlie and then myself, while he watched with a sheepish expression. Charlie coated his helping with sauce and dug in. I disguised my own clump as well as I could and followed his example without much enthusiasm. We ate in silence for a moment. Charlie was still scanning the news, so I picked up my much-abused copy of Wuthering Heights from where I'd left it this morning at breakfast, and tried to lose myself in turn-of-the-century England while I waited for him to start talking. I was just to the part where Heathcliff returns when Charlie cleared his throat and threw the paper to the floor. "You're right," Charlie said. "I did have a reason for doing this." He waved his fork at the gluey spread. "I wanted to talk to you." I laid the book aside. The binding was so destroyed that it slumped flat to the table. "You could have just asked." He nodded, his eyebrows pulling together. "Yeah, I'll remember that next time. I thought taking dinner off your hands would soften you up." I laughed. "It worked. Your cooking skills have me soft as a marshmallow. What do you need, Dad?" "Well, it's about Jacob." I felt my face harden. "What about him?" I asked through stiff lips. "Easy, Bells. I know you're still upset that he told on you, but it was the right thing. He was being responsible." "Responsible?" I repeated scathingly, rolling my eyes. "Right? So what about Jacob?" The careless question repeated inside my head, anything but trivial. What about Jacob? What was I going to do about him, my former best friend, who was now what? My enemy? I cringed. Charlie's face was suddenly wary. "Don't get mad at me, okay?" "Mad? Well, it's about Edward, too." My eyes narrowed. Charlie's voice got gruffer. "I let him in the house, don't I?" "You do," I admitted. "For brief periods of time. Of course, you might let me out of the house for brief periods now and then, too," I continued, only jokingly. I knew I was on lockdown for the duration of the school year. "I've been pretty good lately." Well, that's kind of where I was heading with this. And then Charlie's face stretched into an unexpected, eye-crinkling grin. For a second, he looked 20 years younger. I saw a dim glimmer of possibility in that smile, but I proceeded slowly. "I'm confused, Dad. Are we talking about Jacob, or Edward, or me being grounded?" The grin flashed again. Sort of all three. And how do they relate? I asked, cautious. Okay, he sighed, raising his hands as if in surrender. So I'm thinking maybe you deserve parole for good behavior. For a teenager, you're amazingly non-whiny. My voice and eyebrows shot up. Seriously? I'm free? Where was this coming from? I'd been positive I would be under house arrest until I actually moved out, and Edward hadn't picked up any wavering in Charlie's thoughts. Charlie held up one finger. Conditionally. The enthusiasm vanished. Fantastic, I groaned. Bella, this is more of a request than a demand, okay? You're free, but I'm hoping you'll use that freedom judiciously. What does that mean? He sighed again. I know you're satisfied to spend all your time with Edward. I spend time with Alice too, I interjected. Edward's sister had no hours of visitation. She came and went as she pleased. Charlie was putty in her capable hands. That's true, he said. But you have other friends besides the Cullens, Bella. Or you used to. We stared at each other for a long moment. When was the last time you spoke to Angela Weber? He threw at me. Friday at lunch, I answered immediately. Before Edward's return, my school friends had polarized into two groups. I liked to think of those groups as good versus evil. Us and them worked too. The good guys were Angela, her steady boyfriend Ben Chaney, and Mike Newton. These three had all very generously forgiven me for going crazy when Edward left. Lauren Mallory was the evil core of the them side, and almost everyone else, including my first friend in Forks, Jessica Stanley, seemed content to go along with her anti-Bella agenda. With Edward back at school, the dividing line had become even more distinct. Edward's return had taken its toll on Mike's friendship, but Angela was unswervingly loyal, and Ben followed her lead. Despite the natural aversion most humans felt towards the Cullens, Angela sat dutifully beside Alice every day at lunch. After a few weeks, Angela even looked comfortable there. It was difficult not to be charmed by the Cullens, once one gave them the chance to be charming. Outside of school? Charlie asked, calling my attention back. I haven't seen anyone outside of school, Dad. Grounded, remember? And Angela has a boyfriend too. She's always with Ben. If I'm really free, I added, heavy on the skepticism, maybe we could double. Okay, but then he hesitated. You and Jake used to be joined at the hip, and now... I cut him off. Can you get to the point, Dad? What's your condition exactly? I don't think you should dump all your other friends for your boyfriend, Bella. He said it in a stern voice. It's not nice. I think your life would be better balanced if you kept some other people in it. What happened last September, I flinched. Well, if you'd had more of a life outside of Edward Cullen, it might not have been like that. It would have been exactly like that, I muttered. Maybe, maybe not. The point, I reminded him. Use your new freedom to see your other friends too. Keep it balanced. I nodded, slowly. Balance is good. Do I have specific time quotas to fill, though? He made a face, but shook his head. I don't want to make this complicated. Just don't forget your friends. It was a dilemma I was already struggling with. My friends. People who, for their own safety, I would never be able to see again after graduation. So what was the better course of action? Spend time with them while I could, or start the separation now to make it more gradual? I quailed at the idea of the second option. Particularly Jacob, Charlie added before I could think things through more than that. A greater dilemma than the first. It took me a moment to find the right words. Jacob might be difficult. The Blacks are practically family, Bella, he said, stern and fatherly again. And Jacob has been a very, very good friend to you. I know that. Don't you miss him at all? Charlie asked, frustrated. My throat suddenly felt swollen. I had to clear it twice before I answered. Yes, I do miss him, I admitted, still looking down. I miss him a lot. Then why is it difficult? It wasn't something I was at liberty to explain. It was against the rules for normal people, human people like me and Charlie, to know about the clandestine world full of myths and monsters that existed secretly around us. I knew all about the world, and I was in no small amount of trouble as a result. I wasn't about to get Charlie in the same trouble. With Jacob, there is a conflict, I said slowly. A conflict about the friendship thing, I mean. Friendship doesn't always seem to be enough for Jake. I wound my excuse out of details that were true but insignificant, hardly crucial compared to the fact that Jacob's werewolf pack bitterly hated Edward's vampire family, and therefore me too, as I fully intended to join that family. It just wasn't something I could work out with him in a note, and he wouldn't answer my calls. But my plan to deal with the werewolf in person had definitely not gone over well with the vampires. Isn't Edward up for a little healthy competition? Charlie's voice was sarcastic now. I leveled a dark look at him. There's no competition. You're hurting Jake's feelings, avoiding him like this. He'd rather just be friends than nothing. Oh, now I was avoiding him? I'm pretty sure Jake doesn't want to be friends at all. The words burned in my mouth. Where'd you get that idea anyway? Charlie looked embarrassed now. The subject might have come up today with Billy. You and Billy gossip like old women, I complained, stabbing my fork viciously into the congealed spaghetti on my plate. Billy's worried about Jacob, Charlie said. Jake's having a hard time right now. He's depressed. I winced, but kept my eyes on the blob. And then, you were always so happy after spending the day with Jake. Charlie sighed. I'm happy now, I growled fiercely through my teeth. The contrast between my words and tone broke through the tension. Charlie burst into laughter and I had to join in. Okay, I agreed. Balance. And Jacob, he insisted. I'll try. Good. Find that balance, Bella. And oh yeah, you got some mail, Charlie said, closing the subject with no attempt at subtlety. It's by the stove. I didn't move, my thoughts twisting into snarls around Jacob's name. It was most likely junk mail. I'd just gotten a package from my mum yesterday and I wasn't expecting anything else. Charlie shoved his chair away from the table and stretched as he got to his feet. He took his plate to the sink, but before he turned the water on to rinse it, he paused to toss a thick envelope at me. The letter skidded across the table and thunked into my elbow. Thanks, I muttered, puzzled by his pushiness. Then I saw the return address. The letter was from the University of Alaska Southeast. That was quick. Guess I missed the deadline on that one too. Charlie chuckled. I flipped the envelope over and glared up at him. It's open. I was curious. I'm shocked, Sheriff. That's a federal crime? Oh, just read it. I pulled out the letter and a folded schedule of courses. Congratulations, he said, before I could read anything. Your first acceptance. Thanks, Dad. We should talk about tuition. I've got some money saved up. Hey, none of that. I'm not touching your retirement, Dad. I've got my college fund. What was left of it, and there hadn't been much to begin with. Charlie frowned. Some of these places are pretty pricey, Bells. I want to help. You don't have to go all the way to Alaska just because it's cheaper. It wasn't cheaper. Not at all. But it was far away. And Juneau had an average of 321 overcast days per year. The first was my prerequisite. The second was Edward's. I've got it covered. Besides, there's lots of financial aid out there. It's easy to get loans. I hoped my bluff wasn't too obvious. I hadn't actually done a lot of research on the subject. So, Charlie began and then pursed his lips and looked away. So what? Nothing, I was just... He frowned. Just wondering what Edward's plans are for next year. Oh. Well. 3 quick raps on the door saved me. Charlie rolled his eyes and I jumped up. Coming, I called while Charlie mumbled something that sounded like, "Go away." I ignored him and went to let Edward in. I wrenched the door out of my way, ridiculously eager. And there he was. My personal miracle. Time had not made me immune to the perfection of his face, and I was sure that I would never take any aspect of him for granted. My eyes traced over his pale and white features, the hard square of his jaw, the softer curve of his full lips, twisted up into a smile now, the straight line of his nose, the sharp angle of his cheekbones, the smooth marble span of his forehead, partially obscured by a tangle of rain-darkened bronze hair. I saved his eyes for last, knowing that when I looked into them, I was likely to lose my train of thought. They were wide, warm, with liquid gold, and framed by a thick fringe of black lashes. Staring into his eyes always made me feel extraordinary, sort of like my bones were turning spongy. I was also a little lightheaded, but that could have been because I'd forgotten to keep breathing. Again. It was a face any male model in the world would trade his soul for. Of course, that might be exactly the asking price. 1 soul. No, I didn't believe that. I felt guilty for even thinking it, and was glad, as I was often glad, that I was the one person whose thoughts were a mystery to Edward. I reached for his hand, and sighed when his cold fingers found mine. His touch brought with it the strangest sense of relief, as if I'd been in pain, and that pain had suddenly ceased. Hey, I smiled a little at my anticlimactic greeting. He raised our interlaced fingers to brush my cheek with the back of his hand. How was your afternoon? Slow. For me as well. He pulled my wrist up to his face, our hands still twisted together. His eyes closed as his nose skimmed along the skin there, and he smiled gently without opening them, enjoying the bouquet while resisting the wine, as he'd once put it. I knew that the scent of my blood, so much sweeter to him than any other person's blood, truly like wine beside water to an alcoholic, caused him actual pain from the burning thirst it engendered. But he didn't seem to shy away from it as much as he once had. I could only dimly imagine the Herculean effort behind this simple gesture. It made me sad that he had to try so hard. I comforted myself with the knowledge that I wouldn't be causing him pain much longer. I heard Charlie approaching then, stamping his feet on the way to express his customary displeasure with our guest. Edward's eyes snapped open, and he let our hands fall, keeping them twined. Good evening, Charlie. Edward was always flawlessly polite, though Charlie didn't deserve it. Charlie grunted at him, and then stood there with his arms crossed over his chest. He was taking the idea of parental supervision to extremes lately. I brought another set of applications, Edward told me then, holding up a stuffed manila envelope. He was wearing a roll of stamps like a ring around his littlest finger. I groaned. How were there any colleges left that he hadn't forced me to apply to already? And how did he keep finding these loophole openings? It was so late in the year. He smiled, as if he could read my thoughts. They must have been very obvious on my face. There are still a few open deadlines, and a few places willing to make exceptions. I could just imagine the motivations behind such exceptions, and the dollar amounts involved. Edward laughed at my expression. "Shall we?" he asked, towing me toward the kitchen table. Charlie huffed and followed behind, though he could hardly complain about the activity on tonight's agenda. He had been pestering me to make a decision about college on a daily basis. I cleared the table quickly while Edward organized an intimidating stack of forms. When I moved Wuthering Heights to the counter, Edward raised one eyebrow. I knew what he was thinking, but Charlie interrupted before Edward could comment. "Speaking of college applications, Edward," Charlie said, his tone even more sullen. He tried to avoid addressing Edward directly, and when he had to, it exacerbated his bad mood. "Bella and I were just talking about next year. Have you decided where you're going to school?" Edward smiled up at Charlie, and his voice was friendly. "Not yet. I've received a few acceptance letters, but I'm still weighing my options." "Where have you been accepted?" Charlie pressed. "Syracuse, Harvard, Dartmouth, and I just got accepted to the University of Alaska Southeast today." Edward turned his face slightly to the side so he could wink at me. I stifled a giggle. "Harvard, Dartmouth," Charlie mumbled, unable to conceal his awe. "Well, that's pretty... that's something, yeah." "Yeah, but the University of Alaska, you wouldn't really consider that when you could go Ivy League. I mean, your father would want you to..." "Carlisle's always fine with whatever I choose to do," Edward told him serenely. "Guess what, Edward?" I asked in a bright voice, playing along. "What, Bella?" I pointed to the thick envelope on the counter. "I just got my acceptance to the University of Alaska." "Congratulations," he grinned. "What a coincidence." Charlie's eyes narrowed and he glared back and forth between the two of us. "Fine," he muttered. "I'm going to go watch the game, Bella. 9:30. That was his usual parting command. He sighed. "Right, okay, 10:30. You still have a curfew on school nights." "Bella's no longer grounded?" Edward asked. Though I knew he wasn't really surprised, I couldn't detect any false note to the sudden excitement in his voice. "Conditionally," Charlie corrected through his teeth. "What's it to you?" I frowned at my dad, but he didn't see. "It's just good to know," Edward said. "Alice has been itching for a shopping partner, and I'm sure Bella would love to see some city lights." He smiled at me. But Charlie growled, "No," and his face flushed purple. "Dad, what's the problem?" He made an effort to unclench his teeth. "I don't want you going to Seattle right now." "Huh?" "I told you about that story in the paper. There's some kind of gang on a killing spree in Seattle, and I want you to steer clear, okay?" I rolled my eyes. "Dad, there's a better chance I'll get struck by lightning than the one day I'm in Seattle." "No, that's fine, Charlie," Edward said, interrupting me. "I didn't mean Seattle. I was thinking Portland, actually. I wouldn't have Bella in Seattle either. Of course not." I looked at him in disbelief, but he had Charlie's newspaper in his hands, and he was reading the front page intently. He must have been trying to appease my father, The idea of being in danger from even the most deadly of humans while I was with Alice or Edward was downright hilarious. It worked. Charlie stared at Edward for 1 second more and then shrugged. Fine. He stalked off toward the living room, in a bit of a hurry now. Maybe he didn't want to miss tip-off. I waited till the TV was on so that Charlie wouldn't be able to hear me. What? I started to ask. Hold on, Edward said, without looking up from the paper. His eyes stayed focused on the page as he pushed the first application toward me across the table. I think you can recycle your essays for this one. Same questions. Charlie must still be listening. I sighed and started to fill out the repetitive information. Name, address, social. After a few minutes I glanced up, but Edward was now staring pensively out the window. As I bent my head back to my work, I noticed for the first time the name of the school. I snorted and shoved the papers aside. Bella? Be serious, Edward. Dartmouth? Edward lifted the discarded application and laid it gently in front of me again. I think you'd like New Hampshire, he said. There's a full complement of night courses for me, and the forests are very conveniently located for the avid hiker. Plentiful wildlife. He pulled out the crooked smile he knew I couldn't resist. I took a deep breath through my nose. I'll let you pay me back if that makes you happy, he promised. If you want, I can charge you interest. Like I could even get in without some enormous bribe. Or was that part of the loan? The new Cullen wing of the library? Ugh, why are we having this discussion again? Will you just fill out the application, please, Bella? It won't hurt you to apply. My jaw flexed. You know what? I don't think I will. I reached for the papers, planning to crumple them into a suitable shape for lobbing at the trash can, but they were already gone. I stared at the empty table for a moment, and then at Edward. He didn't appear to have moved, but the application was probably already tucked away in his jacket. What are you doing? I demanded. I sign your name better than you do yourself. You've already written the essays. You're going way overboard with this, you know, I whispered on the off chance that Charlie wasn't completely lost in his game. I really don't need to apply anywhere else. I've been accepted in Alaska. I can almost afford the first semester's tuition. It's as good an alibi as any. There's no need to throw away a bunch of money, no matter whose it is. A pained look tightened his face. Bella, don't start. I agree that I need to go through the motions for Charlie's sake, but we both know I'm not going to be in any condition to go to school next fall, to be anywhere near people. My knowledge of those first few years as a new vampire was sketchy. Edward had never gone into details. It wasn't his favorite subject, but I knew it wasn't pretty. Self-control was apparently an acquired skill. Anything more than correspondence school was out of the question. I thought the timing was still undecided, Edward reminded me softly. You might enjoy a semester or two of college. There are a lot of human experiences you've never had. I'll get to those afterward. They won't be human experiences afterward. You don't get a second chance at humanity, Bella. I sighed. You've got to be reasonable about the timing, Edward. It's just too dangerous to mess around with. There's no danger yet, he insisted. I glared at him. No danger. Sure, I only had a sadistic vampire trying to avenge her mate's death with my own, preferably through some slow and torturous method. Who was worried about Victoria? And oh yeah, the Volturi, the vampire royal family with their small army of vampire warriors who insisted that my heart stop beating one way or another in the near future because humans weren't allowed to know they existed. Right. No reason at all to panic. Even with Alice keeping watch, Edward was relying on her uncannily accurate visions of the future to give us advance warning. It was insane to take chances. Besides, I'd already won this argument. The date for my transformation was tentatively set for shortly after my graduation from high school, only a handful of weeks away. A sharp jolt of unease pierced my stomach as I realized how short the time really was. Of course, this change was necessary, and the key to what I wanted more than anything else in the world put together. But I was deeply conscious of Charlie, sitting in the other room, enjoying his game, just like every other night. And my mother, Renee, far away in sunny Florida, still pleading with me to spend the summer on the beach with her and her new husband. And Jacob, who unlike my parents would know exactly what was going on when I disappeared to some distant school. Even if my parents didn't grow suspicious for a long time, even if I could put off visits with excuses about travel expenses or study loads or illnesses, Jacob would know the truth. For a moment, the idea of Jacob's certain revulsion overshadowed every other pain. Bella, Edward murmured, his face twisting when he read the distress in mine. There's no hurry. I won't let anyone hurt you. You can take all the time you need. I want to hurry, I whispered, smiling weakly, trying to make a joke out of it. I want to be a monster too. His teeth clenched. He spoke through them. You have no idea what you're saying. Abruptly, he flung the damp newspaper onto the table in between us. His finger stabbed the headline on the front page. Death toll on the rise. Police fear gang activity. What does that have to do with anything? Monsters are not a joke, Bella. I stared at the headline again, and then up to his hard expression. A vampire is doing this? I whispered. He smiled without humor. His voice was low and cold. You'd be surprised, Bella, at how often my kind are the source behind the horrors in your human news. It's easy to recognize when you know what to look for. The information here indicates a newborn vampire is loose in Seattle. Bloodthirsty, wild, out of control, the way we all were. I let my gaze drop to the paper again, avoiding his eyes. We've been monitoring the situation for a few weeks. All the signs are there. The unlikely disappearances, always in the night. The poorly disposed of corpses, the lack of other evidence. Yes, someone brand new, and no one seems to be taking responsibility for the neophyte. He took a deep breath. Well, it's not our problem. We wouldn't even pay attention to the situation if it wasn't going on so close to home. Like I said, this happens all the time. The existence of monsters results in monstrous consequences. I tried not to see the names on the page, but they jumped out from the rest of the print like they were in bold. The 5 people whose lives were over, whose families were mourning now. It was different from considering murder in the abstract, reading those names. Maureen Gardner, Jeffrey Campbell, Grace Razzie, Michelle O'Connell, Ronald Albrook. People who'd had parents and children and friends and pets and jobs and hopes and plans and memories and futures. It won't be the same for me, I whispered half to myself. You won't let me be like that. We'll live in Antarctica. Edward snorted, breaking the tension. Penguins. Lovely. I laughed a shaky laugh and knocked the paper off the table so I wouldn't have to see those names. It hit the linoleum with a thud. Of course, Edward would consider the hunting possibilities. He and his vegetarian family all committed to protecting human life. They preferred the flavor of large predators for satisfying their dietary needs. Alaska, then, as planned. Only somewhere much more remote than Juneau. Somewhere with grizzlies galore. Better, he allowed. There are polar bears too, very fierce. And the wolves get quite large. My mouth fell open, and my breath blew out in a sharp gust. "What's wrong?" he asked, before I could recover. The confusion vanished, and his whole body seemed to harden. "Oh, never mind the wolves then, if the idea is offensive to you." His voice was stiff, formal, his shoulders rigid. "He was my best friend, Edward," I muttered. It stung to use the past tense. "Of course the idea offends me." "Please, forgive my thoughtlessness," he said, still very formal. "I shouldn't have suggested that." "Don't worry about it." I stared at my hands clenched into a double fist on the table. We were both silent for a moment, and then his cool finger was under my chin, coaxing my face up. His expression was much softer now. "Sorry. Really. I know it's not the same thing. I shouldn't have reacted that way. It's just, I was already thinking about Jacob before you came over." I hesitated. His tawny eyes seemed to get a little bit darker whenever I said Jacob's name. My voice turned, pleading in response. "Charlie says Jake's having a hard time. He's hurting right now, and it's my fault." "You've done nothing wrong, Bella." I took a deep breath. "I need to make it better, Edward. I owe him that, and it's one of Charlie's conditions anyway." His face changed while I spoke, turning hard again, statue-like. "You know it's out of the question for you to be around a werewolf unprotected, Bella. And it would break the treaty if any of us cross over onto their land. Do you want us to start a war?" "Of course not." "Then there's really no point in discussing the matter further." He dropped his hand and looked away, searching for a subject change. His eyes paused on something behind me. Then he smiled, though his eyes stayed wary. "I'm glad Charlie's decided to let you out. You're sadly in need of a visit to the bookstore. I can't believe you're reading Wuthering Heights again. Don't you know it by heart yet?" "Not all of us have photographic memories," I said curtly. "Photographic memory or not, I don't understand why you like it. The characters are ghastly people who ruin each other's lives. I don't know how Heathcliff and Cathy ended up being ranked with couples like Romeo and Juliet or Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. It isn't a love story. It's a hate story." "You have some serious issue with the classics," I snapped. "Perhaps it's because I'm not impressed by antiquity," he smiled, evidently satisfied he'd distracted me. "Honestly, though, why do you read it over and over?" His eyes were vivid with real interest now, trying again to unravel the convoluted workings of my mind. He reached across the table to cradle my face in his hand. "What is it that appeals to you?" His sincere curiosity disarmed me. "I'm not sure," I said, scrambling for coherency, while his gaze unintentionally scattered my thoughts. "I think it's something about the inevitability. How nothing can keep them apart. Not her selfishness, or his evil, or even death in the end." His face was thoughtful as he considered my words. After a moment, he smiled a teasing smile. "I still think it would be a better story if either of them had one redeeming quality." "I think that may be the point," I disagreed. Their love is their only redeeming quality. I hope you have better sense than that to fall in love with someone so malignant. It's a bit late for me to worry about who I fall in love with, I pointed out. But even without the warning, I seem to have managed fairly well. He laughed quietly. I'm glad you think so. Well, I hope you're smart enough to stay away from someone so selfish. Catherine is really the source of all the trouble, not Heathcliff. I'll be on my guard, he promised. I sighed. He was so good at distractions. I put my hand over his to hold it to my face. I need to see Jacob. His eyes closed. No. It's truly not dangerous at all, I said, pleading again. I used to spend all day in the push with the whole lot of them. Nothing ever happened. But I made a slip. My voice faltered at the end because I realized as I was saying the words that they were a lie. It was not true that nothing had ever happened. A brief flash of memory. An enormous grey wolf crouched to spring, baring his dagger-like teeth at me. It had my palms sweating with an echo of remembered panic. Edward heard my heart accelerate and nodded as if I'd acknowledged the lie aloud. Werewolves are unstable. Sometimes the people near them get hurt. Sometimes they get killed. I wanted to deny it, but another image slowed my rebuttal. I saw in my head the once beautiful face of Emily Young, now marred by a trio of dark scars that dragged down the corner of her right eye and left her mouth warped forever into a lopsided scowl. He waited, grimly triumphant, for me to find my voice. You don't know them, I whispered. I know them better than you think, Bella. I was here the last time. The last time? We started crossing paths with the wolves about 70 years ago. We had just settled near Hoquiam. That was before Alice and Jasper were with us. We outnumbered them, but that wouldn't have stopped it from turning into a fight if not for Carlyle. He managed to convince Ephraim Black that coexisting was possible, and eventually we made the truce. Jacob's great-grandfather's name startled me. We thought the line had died out with Ephraim. Edward muttered. It sounded like he was talking to himself now. That the genetic quirk which allowed the transmutation had been lost. He broke off and stared at me accusingly. Your bad luck seems to get more potent every day. Do you realize that your insatiable pull for all things deadly was strong enough to recover a pack of mutant canines from extinction? If we could bottle your luck, we'd have a weapon of mass destruction on our hands. I ignored the ribbing, my attention caught by his assumption. Was he serious? But I didn't bring them back. Don't you know? Know what? My bad luck had nothing to do with it. The werewolves came back because the vampires did. Edward stared at me, his body motionless with surprise. Jacob told me it was your family being here that set things in motion. I thought you would already know. His eyes narrowed. Is that what they think? Edward, look at the facts. 70 years ago you came here and the werewolves showed up. You come back now and the werewolves show up again. Do you think that's a coincidence? He blinked and his glare relaxed. Carlyle will be interested in that theory. Theory? I scoffed. He was silent for a moment, staring out of the window into the rain. I imagined he was contemplating the fact his family's presence was turning the locals into giant dogs. Interesting, but not exactly relevant, he murmured after a moment. The situation remains the same. I could translate that easily enough. No werewolf friends. I knew I must be patient with Edward. It wasn't that he was unreasonable, it was just that he didn't understand. He had No idea how very much I owed Jacob Black. My life, many times over, and possibly my sanity too. I didn't like to talk about that barren time with anyone, and especially not Edward. He had only been trying to save me when he'd left, trying to save my soul. I didn't hold him responsible for all the stupid things I'd done in his absence, or the pain I had suffered. He did. So I would have to word my explanation very carefully. I got up and walked around the table. He opened his arms for me and I sat on his lap, nestling into his cool stone embrace. I looked at his hands while I spoke. Please, just listen for a minute. This is so much more important than some whim to drop in on an old friend. Jacob is in pain. My voice distorted around the word. I can't not try to help him. I can't give up on him now when he needs me. Just because he's not human all the time, well, he was there for me when I was not so human myself. You don't know what it was like. I hesitated. Edward's arms were rigid around me. His hands were in fists now, the tendons standing out. If Jacob hadn't helped me, I'm not sure what you would have come home to. I owe him better than this, Edward. I looked up at his face warily. His eyes were closed. His jaw was strained. I'll never forgive myself for leaving you, he whispered. Not if I live 100,000 years. I put my hand against his cold face and waited until he sighed and opened his eyes. You were just trying to do the right thing, and I'm sure it would have worked with anyone less mental than me. Besides, you're here now. That's the part that matters. If I'd never left, you wouldn't feel the need to go risk your life to comfort a dog. I flinched. I was used to Jacob and all his derogatory slurs. Bloodsucker, leech, parasite. Somehow it sounded harsher in Edward's velvet voice. I don't know how to phrase this properly, Edward said, and his tone was bleak. It's going to sound cruel, I suppose, but I've come too close to losing you in the past. I know what it feels like to think I have. I am not going to tolerate anything dangerous. You have to trust me on this, I'll be fine. His face was pained again. Please, Bella, he whispered. I stared into his suddenly burning golden eyes. Please what? Please, for me, please make a conscious effort to keep yourself safe. I'll do everything I can, but I would appreciate a little help. I'll work on it, I murmured. Do you really have any idea how important you are to me? Any concept at all of how much I love you? He pulled me tighter against his hard chest, tucking my head under his chin. I pressed my lips against his snow-cold neck. I know how much I love you, I answered. You compare one small tree to the entire forest. I rolled my eyes, but he couldn't see. Impossible. He kissed the top of my head and sighed. No werewolves. I'm not going along with that. I have to see Jacob. Then I'll have to stop you. He sounded utterly confident that this wouldn't be a problem. I was sure he was right. We'll see about that, I bluffed anyway. He's still my friend. I could feel Jacob's note in my pocket, like it suddenly weighed 10 pounds. I could hear the words in his voice, and he seemed to be agreeing with Edward. Something that would never happen in reality. Doesn't change anything. Sorry. I felt oddly buoyant as I walked from Spanish toward the cafeteria, and it wasn't just because I was holding hands with the most perfect person on the planet, though that was certainly part of it. Maybe it was the knowledge that my sentence was served and I was a free woman again. Or maybe it wasn't anything to do with me specifically. Maybe it was the atmosphere of freedom that hung over the entire campus. School was winding down, and for the senior class especially, there was a perceptible thrill in the air. Freedom was so close it was touchable, tasteable. Signs of it were everywhere. Posters crowded together on the cafeteria walls, and the trash cans wore a colourful skirt of spilled over flyers. Reminders to buy yearbooks, class rings, and announcements. Deadlines to order graduation gowns, hats, and tassels. Neon bright sales pitches. The juniors campaigning for class office. Ominous rose-wreathed advertisements for this year's prom. The big dance was this coming weekend, but I had an ironclad promise from Edward that I would not be subjected to that again. After all, I'd already had that human experience. No, it must be my personal freedom that lightened me today. The ending of the school year did not give me the pleasure it seemed to give the other students. Actually, I felt nervous to the point of nausea whenever I thought of it. I tried to not think of it. But it was hard to escape such an omnipresent topic as graduation. "Have you sent your announcements yet?" Angela asked when Edward and I sat down at our table. She had her light brown hair pulled back into a sloppy ponytail, instead of her usual smooth hairdo, and there was a slightly frantic look about her eyes. Alice and Ben were already there too, on either side of Angela. Ben was intent on a comic book, his glasses sliding down his narrow nose. Alice was scrutinizing my boring jeans and a t-shirt outfit in a way that made me self-conscious, probably plotting another makeover. I sighed. My indifferent attitude to fashion was a constant thorn in her side. If I'd allow it, she'd love to dress me every day, perhaps several times a day, like some oversized three-dimensional paper doll. "No," I answered Angela. "There's no point, really. Renee knows when I'm graduating. Who else is there?" "How about you, Alice?" Alice smiled. "All done." "Lucky you," Angela sighed. "My mother has 1,000 cousins, and she expects me to hand address one to everybody. I'm going to get carpal tunnel. I can't put it off any longer, and I'm just dreading it." "I'll help you," I volunteered, "if you don't mind my awful handwriting." Charlie would like that. From the corner of my eye, I saw Edward smile. He must like that. Me fulfilling Charlie's conditions without involving werewolves. Angela looked relieved. "That's so nice of you. I'll come over any time you want." "Actually, I'd rather go to your house, if that's okay. I'm sick of mine. Charlie ungrounded me last night." I grinned as I announced my good news. "Really?" Angela asked, mild excitement lighting her always gentle brown eyes. "I thought you said you were in for life." "I'm more surprised than you are. I was sure I would have at least finished high school before he set me free." "Well, this is great, Bella. We'll have to go out to celebrate." "You have no idea how good that sounds." "What should we do?" Alice mused, her face lighting up at the possibilities. Alice's ideas were usually a little grandiose for me, and I could see it in her eyes now, the tendency to take things too far kicking into action. "Whatever you're thinking, Alice, I doubt I'm that free." "Free's free, right?" she insisted. "I'm sure I still have boundaries, like the continental US, for example." Angela and Ben laughed, but Alice grimaced in real disappointment. "So what are we doing tonight?" she persisted. "Nothing. Look, let's give it a couple of days to make sure he wasn't joking. It's a school night anyway." We'll celebrate this weekend then. Alice's enthusiasm was impossible to repress. Sure, I said, hoping to placate her. I knew I wasn't going to do anything too outlandish. It would be safer to take it slow with Charlie. Give him a chance to appreciate how trustworthy and mature I was before I asked for any favors. Angela and Alice started talking about options. Ben joined the conversation, setting his comics aside. My attention drifted. I was surprised to find that the subject of my freedom was suddenly not as gratifying as it had been just a moment ago. While they discussed things to do in Port Angeles, or maybe Hoquiam, I began to feel disgruntled. It didn't take long to determine where my restlessness stemmed from. Ever since I'd said goodbye to Jacob Black in the forest outside my home, I'd been plagued by a persistent, uncomfortable intrusion of a specific mental picture. It popped into my thoughts at regular intervals, like some annoying alarm clock set to sound every half hour, filling my head with the image of Jacob's face crumpled in pain. This was my last memory I had of him. As the disturbing vision struck again, I knew exactly why I was dissatisfied with my liberty. Because it was incomplete. Sure, I was free to go anywhere I wanted, except La Push. Free to do anything I wanted, except see Jacob. I frowned at the table. There had to be some kind of middle ground. Alice? Alice? Angela's voice yanked me from my reverie. She was waving her hand back and forth in front of Alice's blank, staring face. Alice's expression was something I recognized, an expression that sent an automatic shock of panic through my body. The vacant look in her eyes told me that she was seeing something very different from the mundane lunchroom scene that surrounded us, but something that was every bit as real in its own way. Something that was coming. Something that would happen soon. I felt the blood slither from my face. Then Edward laughed. A very natural, relaxed sound. Angela and Ben looked toward him, but my eyes were locked on Alice. She jumped suddenly, as if someone had kicked her under the table. "Is it nap time already, Alice?" Edward teased. Alice was herself again. "Sorry, I was daydreaming, I guess." "Daydreaming's better than facing 2 more hours of school," Ben said. Alice threw herself back into the conversation with more animation than before, just a little bit too much. Once I saw her eyes lock with Edward's, only for a moment, and then she looked back to Angela before anyone else noticed. Edward was quiet, playing absent-mindedly with a strand of my hair. I waited anxiously for a chance to ask Edward what Alice had seen in her vision, but the afternoon passed without 1 minute of alone time. It felt odd to me, almost deliberate. After lunch, Edward slowed his pace to match Ben's, talking about some assignment I knew he'd already finished. Then there was always someone else there between classes, that we usually had a few minutes to ourselves. When the final bell rang, Edward struck up a conversation with Mike Newton of all people, falling into step beside him as Mike headed for the parking lot. I trailed behind, letting Edward tow me along. I listened, confused, while Mike answered Edward's unusually friendly queries. It seemed Mike was having car troubles. "But I just replaced the battery," Mike was saying. His eyes darted ahead and then back to Edward warily, mystified, just like I was. "Perhaps it's the cables," Edward offered. "Maybe. I really don't know anything about cars," Mike admitted. "I need to have someone look at it, but I can't afford to take it to Dowling's." I opened my mouth to suggest my mechanic, and then snapped it shut again. My mechanic was busy these days, busy running around as a giant wolf. "I know a few things. I could take a look if you like," Edward offered. Just let me drop Alice and Bella at home. Mike and I both stared at Edward with our mouths hanging open. Thanks, Mike mumbled when he recovered. But I have to get to work. Maybe some other time? Absolutely. See ya. Mike climbed into his car, shaking his head in disbelief. Edward's Volvo, with Alice already inside, was just 2 cars away. What was that about? I muttered as Edward held the passenger door for me. Just being helpful, Edward answered. And then Alice, waiting in the back seat, was babbling at top speed. You're really not that good a mechanic, Edward. Maybe you should have Rosalie take a look at it tonight, just so you look good if Mike decides to let you help, you know? Not that it wouldn't be fun to watch his face if Rosalie showed up to help, but since Rosalie's supposed to be across the country attending college, I guess that's not the best idea. Too bad. Though, I suppose for Mike's car you'll do. It's only within the finer tunings of a good Italian sports car that you're out of your depth, and speaking of Italian sports cars that I stole there, you still owe me a yellow Porsche. I don't know that I want to wait for Christmas. I stopped listening after a minute, letting her quick voice become just a hum in the background as I settled into my patient mode. It looked to me like Edward was trying to avoid my questions. Fine. He would have to be alone with me soon enough. It was only a matter of time. Edward seemed to realize that too. He dropped Alice at the mouth of the Collins Drive as usual, though by this point I half expected him to drive her to the door and walk her in. As she got out, Alice threw a sharp look at his face. Edward seemed completely at ease. "See you later," he said, and then ever so slightly, he nodded. Alice turned to disappear into the trees. He was quiet as he turned the car around and headed back to Forks. I waited, wondering if he would bring it up himself. He didn't, and this made me tense. What had Alice seen today at lunch? Something he didn't want to tell me. And I tried to think of a reason why he would keep secrets. Maybe it would be better to prepare myself before I asked. I didn't want to freak out and have him think I couldn't handle it, whatever it was. So we were both silent until we got back to Charlie's house. "Light homework load tonight," he commented. I assented. "Do you suppose I'm allowed inside again?" Charlie didn't throw a fit when you picked me up for school. But I was sure Charlie was going to turn sulky fast when he got home and found Edward there. Maybe I should make something extra special for dinner. Inside, I headed up the stairs, and Edward followed. He lounged on my bed and gazed out the window, seeming oblivious to my edginess. I stowed my bag and turned the computer on. There was an unanswered email from my mum to attend to, and she got panicky when I took too long. I drummed my fingers as I waited for my decrepit computer to wheeze awake. They snapped against the desk, staccato and anxious. And then his fingers were on mine, holding them still. "Are we a little impatient today?" he murmured. I looked up, intending to make a sarcastic remark, but his face was closer than I'd expected. His golden eyes were smoldering, just inches away, and his breath was cool against my open lips. I could taste his scent on my tongue. I couldn't remember the witty response I'd been about to make. I couldn't remember my name. He didn't give me a chance to recover. If I had my way, I would spend the majority of my time kissing Edward. There wasn't anything I'd experienced in my life that compared to the feeling of his cool lips. Marble hard, but always so gentle, moving with mine. I didn't often get my way, so it surprised me a little when His fingers braided themselves into my hair, securing my face to his. My arms locked behind his neck, and I wished I was stronger, strong enough to keep him prisoner here. One hand slid down my back, pressing me tighter against his stone chest. Even through his sweater, his skin was cold enough to make me shiver. It was a shiver of pleasure, of happiness. But his hands began to loosen in response. I knew I had about 3 seconds before he would sigh and slide me deftly away, saying something about how we'd risked my life enough for one afternoon. Making the most of my last seconds, I crushed myself closer, molding myself to the shape of him. The tip of my tongue traced the curve of his lower lip. It was as flawlessly smooth as if it had been polished. And the taste. He pulled my face away from his, breaking my hold with ease. He probably didn't even realize that I was using all my strength. He chuckled, once, a low, throaty sound. His eyes were bright with the excitement he so rigidly disciplined. "Ah, Bella," he sighed. "I'd say I'm sorry, but I'm not. And I should feel sorry that you're not sorry, but I don't. Maybe I should go sit on the bed." I exhaled a little dizzily. "If you think that's necessary." He smiled crookedly and disentangled himself. I shook my head a few times, trying to clear it, and turned back to my computer. It was all warmed up and humming now. Well, not as much humming as groaning. "Tell Renee I said hello." "Sure thing." I scanned through Renee's email, shaking my head now and then at some of the dippier things she'd done. I was just as entertained and horrified as the first time I'd read this. It was so like my mother to forget exactly how paralyzed she was by heights until she was already strapped to a parachute and a dive instructor. I felt a little frustrated with Phil, her husband of almost 2 years, for allowing that one. I would have taken better care of her. I knew her so much better. You have to let them go their own way eventually, I reminded myself. You have to let them have their own life. I'd spent most of my life taking care of Renee, patiently guiding her away from her craziest plans, good-naturedly enduring the ones that I couldn't talk her out of. I'd always been indulgent with my mum, amused by her, even a little condescending to her. I saw her cornucopia of mistakes and laughed privately to myself. Scatterbrained Renee. I was a very different person from my mother. Someone thoughtful and cautious. The responsible one. The grown-up. That's how I saw myself. That was the person I knew. With the blood still pounding in my head from Edward's kiss, I couldn't help but think of my mother's most life-altering mistake. Silly and romantic. Getting married, fresh out of high school, to a man she barely knew. Then producing me a year later. She'd always promised me that she had no regrets. That I was the best gift her life had ever given her. And yet, she'd drilled it into me over and over. Smart people took marriage seriously. Mature people went to college and started careers before they got deeply involved in a relationship. She knew I would never be as thoughtless and goofy and small town as she had been. I gritted my teeth and tried to concentrate as I answered the letter. Then I hit her parting line and remembered why I'd neglected to write sooner. "You haven't said anything about Jacob in a long time," she'd written. "What's he up to these days?" Charlie was prompting her, I was sure. I sighed and typed quickly, blocking the answer to her question between two less sensitive paragraphs. Jacob is fine, I guess. I don't see him much. He spends most of his time with a pack of his friends down at La Push these days. Smiling wryly to myself, I added Edward's greeting and hit send. I didn't realize that Edward was standing silently behind me again until after I'd turned off the computer and shoved away from the desk. I was about to scold him for reading over my shoulder when I realized he wasn't paying attention to me. He was examining a flat black box with wires curling crookedly away from the main square in a way that didn't look healthy for whatever it was. After a second, I recognized the car stereo Emmett, Rosalie, and Jasper had given me for my last birthday. I'd forgotten about the birthday presents, hiding under a growing pile of dust on the floor of my closet. "What did you do to this?" he asked in a horror-struck voice. "It didn't want to come out of the dashboard, so you felt the need to torture it. You know how I am with tools. No pain was inflicted intentionally." He shook his head, his face a mask of faux tragedy. "You killed it." I shrugged. "Oh well. It would hurt their feelings if they saw this," he said. "I guess it's a good thing you've been on house arrest. I'll have to get another one in place before they notice." "Thanks, but I don't need a fancy stereo." "It's not for your sake that I'm going to replace it." I sighed. "You didn't get much good out of your birthday presents last year," he said in a disgruntled voice. Suddenly he was fanning himself with a stiff rectangle of paper. I didn't answer, for fear my voice would shake. My disastrous 18th birthday, with all its far-reaching consequences, it wasn't something I cared to remember, and I was surprised that he would bring it up. He was even more sensitive about it than I was. "Do you realize these are about to expire?" he asked, holding the paper out to me. It was another present. The voucher for airplane tickets that Esme and Carlisle had given me so that I could visit Renee in Florida. I took a deep breath and answered in a flat voice. No, I had forgotten all about them, actually. His expression was carefully bright and positive. There was no trace of any deep emotion as he continued. "Well, we still have a little time. You've been liberated, and we have no plans this weekend, as you refused to go to the prom with me." He grinned. "Why not celebrate your freedom this way?" I gasped. "By going to Florida?" "You did say something about the continental US being allowable." I glared at him, suspicious, trying to understand where this had come from. "Well," he demanded, "are we going to see Renee or not?" "Charlie will never allow it. Charlie can't keep you from visiting your mother. She still has primary custody." "Nobody has custody of me. I'm an adult." He flashed a brilliant smile. "Exactly." I thought it over for a short minute before deciding that it wasn't worth the fight. Charlie would be furious, not that I was going to see Renee, but that Edward was going with me. Charlie wouldn't speak to me for months, and I'd probably end up grounded again. It was definitely smarter not to even bring it up. Maybe in a few weeks as a graduation favor or something. But the idea of seeing my mother now, not weeks from now, was hard to resist. It had been so long since I'd seen Renee, and even longer since I'd seen her under pleasant circumstances. The last time I'd been with her in Phoenix, I'd spent the whole time in a hospital bed. The last time she'd come here, I'd been more or less catatonic. Not exactly the best memories to leave her with. And maybe, if she saw how happy I was with Edward, she would tell Charlie to ease up. Edward scrutinized my face while I deliberated. I sighed. Not this weekend. Why not? I don't want to fight with Charlie. Not so soon after he's forgiven me. His eyebrows pulled together. I think this weekend's perfect, he muttered. I shook my head. Another time. You aren't the only one who's been trapped in this house, you know. He frowned at me. Suspicion returned. This kind of behavior was unlike him. He was always so impossibly selfless. I knew it was making me spoiled. You can go anywhere you want, I pointed out. The outside world holds no interest for me without you. I rolled my eyes at the hyperbole. I'm serious, he said. Let's take the outside world slowly, alright? For example, we could start with a movie in Port Angeles. He groaned. Oh, never mind. We'll talk about it later. There's nothing left to talk about. He shrugged. Okay then, new subject, I said. I'd almost forgotten my worries about this afternoon. Had that been his intention? What did Alice see today at lunch? My eyes were fixed on his face as I spoke, measuring his reaction. His expression was composed. There was only the slightest hardening of his topaz eyes. She's been seeing Jasper in a strange place. Somewhere in the southwest, she thinks. Near his former family. But he has no conscious intentions to go back. It's got her worried. Oh. That was nothing close to what I'd been expecting. But of course it made sense that Alice would be watching out for Jasper's future. He was her soulmate, her true other half. That they weren't as flamboyant about their relationship as Rosalie and Emmett were. Why didn't you tell me before? I didn't realize you'd noticed, he said. It's probably nothing important in any case. My imagination was sadly out of control. I'd taken a perfectly normal afternoon and twisted it until it looked like Edward was going out of his way to keep things from me. I needed therapy. We went downstairs to work on our homework, just in case Charlie showed up early. Edward finished in minutes. I slogged laboriously through my calculus until I decided it was time to fix Charlie's dinner. Edward helped, making faces every so often at the raw ingredients. Human food was mildly repulsive to him. I made stroganoff from Grandma Swan's recipe because I was sucking up. It wasn't one of my favorites, but it would please Charlie. Charlie seemed to already be in a good mood when he got home. He didn't even go out of his way to be rude to Edward. Edward excused himself from eating with us as usual. The sound of the nightly news drifted from the front room, but I doubted Edward was really watching. After forcing down 3 helpings, Charlie kicked his feet up on the spare chair and folded his hands contentedly across his distended stomach. That was great, Bells. Glad you liked it. How was work? He'd been eating with too much concentration for me to make conversation before. Sort of slow. Well, dead slow, really. Mark and I played cards for a good part of the afternoon, he admitted with a grin. I won 19 hands to 7. Then I was on the phone with Billy for a while. I tried to keep my expression the same. How is he? Good. His joints are bothering him a little. Oh, it's too bad. Yeah. He invited us down to visit this weekend. He was thinking of having the Clearwaters and the Ulis over too, sort of a playoff party. Huh, was my genius response. But what could I say? I knew I wouldn't be allowed to hit a werewolf party, even with parental supervision. I wondered if Edward would have a problem with Charlie hanging out in the push. Or would he suppose that since Charlie was mostly spending time with Billy, who was only human, my father wouldn't be in danger? I got up and piled the dishes together without looking at Charlie. I dumped them into the sink and started the water. Edward appeared silently and grabbed a dish towel. Charlie sighed and gave up for the moment, though I imagined he would revisit the subject when we were alone again. He heaved himself to his feet and headed for the TV, just like every other night. "Charlie," Edward said in a conversational tone. Charlie stopped in the middle of his little kitchen. "Yeah?" "Did Bella ever tell you that my parents gave her airplane tickets on her last birthday so that she could visit Renee?" I dropped the plate I was scrubbing. It glanced off the counter and clattered noisily to the floor. It didn't break, but it spattered the room and all three of us with soapy water. Charlie didn't even seem to notice. "Bella?" he asked in a stunned voice. I kept my eyes on the plate as I retrieved it. "Yeah, they did." Charlie swallowed loudly, and then his eyes narrowed as he turned back to Edward. "No, she's never mentioned it." Edward murmured. "Was there a reason you brought it up?" Charlie asked in a hard voice. Edward shrugged. "They're about to expire. I think it might hurt Esme's feelings if Bella doesn't use her gift. Not that she'd say anything." I stared at Edward in disbelief. Charlie thought for a minute. "It's probably a good idea for you to visit your mum, Bella. She'd love that. I'm surprised you didn't say anything about this, though." "I forgot," I admitted. He frowned. "You forgot that someone gave you plane tickets?" I murmured vaguely and turned back to the sink. "I noticed you said they're about to expire, Edward." Charlie went on. "How many tickets did your parents give her?" "Just one for her, and one for me." The plate I dropped this time landed in the sink, so it didn't make as much noise. I could easily hear the sharp huff as my father exhaled. The blood rushed into my face, fueled by irritation and chagrin. Why was Edward doing this? I glared at the bubbles in the sink, panicking. "That's out of the question." Charlie was abruptly in a rage, shouting the words. "Why?" Edward asked, his voice saturated with innocent surprise. "You just said it was a good idea for her to see her mother." Charlie ignored him. "You're not going anywhere with him, young lady," he yelled. I spun around and he was jabbing a finger at me. Anger pulsed through me automatically, an instinctive reaction to his tone. "I'm not a child, Dad, and I'm not grounded anymore, remember?" "Oh, yes you are, starting now." "For what?" "Because I said so." "Do I need to remind you that I'm a legal adult, Charlie? This is my house. You follow my rules." My glare turned icy. "If that's how you want it. Do you want me to move out tonight, or can I have a few days to pack?" Charlie's face went bright red. I instantly felt horrible for playing the move out card. I took a deep breath and tried to make my tone more reasonable. "I'll do my time without complaining when I've done something wrong, Dad. But I'm not going to put up with your prejudices." He sputtered, but managed nothing coherent. "Now, I know that I have every right to see Mum for the weekend. You can't honestly tell me you'd object to the plan if I was going with Alice or Angela." "Girls," he grunted with a nod. "Would it bother you if I took Jacob?" I'd only picked the name because I knew of my father's preference for Jacob, but I quickly wished I hadn't. Edward's teeth clenched together with an audible snap. My father struggled to compose himself before he answered. "Yes," he said in an unconvincing voice. "That would bother me." "You're a rotten liar, Dad." "Bella, it's not like I'm headed off to Vegas to be a showgirl or anything. I'm going to see Mum," I reminded him. "She's She's just as much my parental authority as you are. He threw me a withering look. Are you implying something about Mum's ability to look after me? Charlie flinched at the threat implicit in my question. You'd better hope I don't mention this to her, I said. You'd better not, he warned. I'm not happy about this, Bella. There's no reason for you to be upset. He rolled his eyes, but I could tell the storm was over. I turned to pull the plug out of the sink. So my homework's done, your dinner is done, the dishes are done, and I'm not grounded. I'm going out. I'll be back before 10:30. Where are you going? His face, almost back to normal, flushed light red again. I'm not sure, I admitted. I'll keep it within a 10-mile radius, though, okay? He grunted something that did not sound like approval and stalked out of the room. Naturally, as soon as I'd won the fight, I began to feel guilty. We're going out? Edward asked, his voice low but enthusiastic. I turned to glower at him. Yes. I think I'd like to speak to you. Alone. He didn't look as apprehensive as I thought he should. I waited to begin until we were safely in his car. What was that? I demanded. I know you want to see your mother, Bella. You've been talking about her in your sleep. Worrying, actually. I have? He nodded. But clearly you were too much of a coward to deal with Charlie, so I interceded on your behalf. Interceded? You threw me to the sharks. He rolled his eyes. I don't think you were in any danger. I told you I didn't want to fight with Charlie. Nobody said that you had to. I glowered at him. I can't help myself when he gets all bossy like that. My natural teenage instincts overpower me. He chuckled. Well, that's not my fault. I stared at him, speculating. He didn't seem to notice. His face was serene as he gazed out the windshield. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Or maybe it was just my imagination again, running wild like it had this afternoon. Does this sudden urge to see Florida have anything to do with the party at Billy's place? His jaw flexed. Nothing at all. It wouldn't matter if you were here or on the other side of the world. You still wouldn't be going. It was just like with Charlie before. Just like being treated as a misbehaving child. I gritted my teeth together so I wouldn't start shouting. I didn't want to fight with Edward too. Edward sighed, and when he spoke, his voice was warm and velvet again. So what do you want to do tonight? He asked. Can we go to your house? I haven't seen Esme in so long. He smiled. She'll like that, especially when she hears what we're doing this weekend. I groaned in defeat. We didn't stay out late, as I'd promised. I was not surprised to see the lights still on when we pulled up in front of the house. I knew Charlie would be waiting to yell at me some more. You'd better not come inside, I said. It will only make things worse. His thoughts are relatively calm, Edward teased. His expression made me wonder if there was some additional joke I was missing. The corners of his mouth twitched, fighting a smile. I'll see you later, I muttered glumly. He laughed and kissed the top of my head. I'll be back when Charlie's snoring. The TV was loud when I got inside. I briefly considered trying to sneak past him. Would you come in here, Bella? Charlie called, sinking that plan. My feet dragged as I took the 5 necessary steps. What's up, Dad? Did you have a nice time tonight? He asked. He seemed ill at ease. I looked for hidden meaning in his words before I answered. Yes, I said hesitantly. What did you do? I shrugged. Hung out with Alice and Jasper. Edward beat Alice at chess, and then I played Jasper. He buried me. I smiled. Edward and Alice playing chess was one of the funniest things I'd ever seen. They'd sat there nearly motionless, staring at the board, while Alice foresaw the moves he would make, and he picked the moves she would make in return out of her head. They played most of the game in their minds. I think they'd each moved 2 pawns when Alice suddenly flicked her king over and surrendered. It took all of 3 minutes. Charlie hit the mute button, an unusual action. Look, there's something I need to say. He frowned, looking very uncomfortable. I sat still, waiting. He met my gaze for a second before shifting his eyes to the floor. He didn't say anything more. What is it, Dad? He sighed. I'm not good at this kind of thing. I don't know how to start. I waited again. Okay, Bella, here's the thing. He got up from the couch and started pacing back and forth across the room, looking at his feet all the time. You and Edward seem to be pretty serious, and there are some things that you need to be careful about. I know you're an adult now, but you're still young, Bella. And there are a lot of important things you need to know when you're physically involved with... Oh, please no, I begged, jumping to my feet. Please tell me you are not trying to have a sex talk with me, Charlie. He glared at the floor. I am your father, and I have responsibilities. Remember, I'm just as embarrassed as you are. I don't think that's humanly possible. Anyway, Mum beat you to the punch about 10 years ago. You're off the hook. 10 years ago, you didn't have a boyfriend, he muttered unwillingly. I could tell he was battling with his desire to drop the subject. We were both standing up, looking at the floor and facing away from each other. I don't think the essentials have changed that much, I mumbled. My face had to be as red as his. This was beyond the 7th circle of Hades. Even worse was realizing that Edward had known this was coming. No wonder he'd seemed so smug in the car. Just tell me that you two are being responsible, Charlie pleaded, obviously wishing a pit would open in the floor so that he could fall in. Don't worry about it, Dad. It's not like that. Not that I don't trust you, Bella, but I know you don't want to tell me anything about this, and, I don't really want to hear it. I will try to be open-minded, though. I know times have changed. I laughed awkwardly. Maybe the times have, but Edward is very old-fashioned. You have nothing to worry about. Charlie sighed. Sure he is, he muttered. Oh, I groaned. I really wish you were not forcing me to say this out loud, Dad. Really, but I am a virgin, and I have no immediate plans to change that status. We both cringed, but then Charlie's face smoothed out. He seemed to believe me. Can I go to bed now, please? In a minute, he said. Please, Dad, I'm begging you. The embarrassing part's over, I promise, he assured me. I shot a glance at him, and was grateful to see that he looked more relaxed, that his face was back to its regular color. He sank down onto the sofa, sighing with a relief that he was past the sex speech. What now? I just wanted to know how the balance thing's coming along. Oh, good. I guess. I made plans with Angela today. I'm going to help her with her graduation announcements. Just us girls. That's nice. And what about Jake? I sighed. I haven't figured that one out yet, Dad. Keep trying, Bella. I know you'll do the right thing. You're a good person. Nice. So if I didn't figure out some way to make things right with Jacob, then I was a bad person? That was below the belt. Sure, I agreed. The automatic response almost made me smile. It was something I'd picked up from Jacob. I even said it in the same patronizing tone he used with his own father. Charlie grinned and turned the sound back on. He slumped lower into the cushions, pleased with his night's work. I could tell he would be up with the game for a while. Night, Bells. See you in the morning. I sprinted for the stairs. Edward was long gone, and he wouldn't be back until Charlie was asleep. He was probably out hunting or something to pass the time, so I was in no hurry to undress for bed. I wasn't in the mood to be alone, but I certainly wasn't going to go back downstairs to hang out with my dad, just in case he thought of some topic of sex education that he hadn't touched on before. I shuddered. So thanks to Charlie, I was wound up and anxious. My homework was done, and I didn't feel mellow enough for reading or just listening to music. I considered calling Renee with the news of my visit, but then I realized it was 3 hours later in Florida and she would be asleep. I could call Angela, I supposed, but suddenly I knew that it wasn't Angela that I wanted to talk to, that I needed to talk to. I stared at the blank black window, biting my lip. I don't know how long I stood there, weighing the pros against the cons, doing the right thing by Jacob, seeing my closest friend again, being a good person, versus making Edward furious with me. 10 minutes, maybe. Long enough to decide that the pros were valid while the cons were not. Edward was only concerned about my safety, and I knew that there was really no problem on that count. The phone wasn't any help. Jacob had refused to answer my phone calls since Edward's return. Besides, I needed to see him smiling again the way he used to. I needed to replace that awful last memory of his face, warped, twisted by pain, if I was ever going to have any peace of mind. I had an hour, probably. I could make a quick run down to the push and be back before Edward realized I had gone. It was past my curfew, but would Charlie really care about that when Edward wasn't involved? One way to find out. I grabbed my jacket and shoved my arms through the sleeves as I ran down the stairs. Charlie looked up from the game, instantly suspicious. You care if I go see Jake tonight? I asked breathlessly. I won't stay long. As soon as I said Jake's name, Charlie's expression relaxed into a smug smile. He didn't seem surprised at all that his lecture had taken effect so quickly. Sure, kid. No problem. Stay as long as you like. Thanks, Dad. I darted out of the door. Like any fugitive, I couldn't help looking over my shoulder a few times while I jogged to my truck. The night was so black that there really was no point. I had to feel my way along the side of the truck to the handle. My eyes were just beginning to adjust as I shoved my keys in the ignition. I twisted them hard to the left, but instead of roaring deafeningly to life, the engine just clicked. I tried it again with the same results. And then a small motion in my peripheral vision made me jump. Gah! I gasped in shock when I saw that I was not alone in the cab. Edward sat very still, a faint bright spot in the darkness, only his hands moving as he turned a mysterious black object around and around. He stared at the object as he spoke. Alice called, he murmured. Alice. Damn, I'd forgotten to account for her in my plans. He must have her watching me. She got nervous when your future rather abruptly disappeared 5 minutes ago. My eyes, already wide with surprise, popped wider. Because she can't see the wolves, you know, he explained in the same low murmur. Had you forgotten that? When you decide to mingle your fate with theirs, you disappear too. You couldn't know that part, I realize that, but can you understand why that might make me a little anxious? Alice saw you disappear, and she couldn't even tell if you'd come home or not. Your future got lost, just like this. We're not sure why this is. Some natural defense they're born with. He spoke as if he were talking to himself now, still looking at the piece of my truck's engine as he twirled it in his hands. That doesn't seem entirely likely, since I haven't had any trouble reading their thoughts. The blacks, at least. Carlyle theorizes that it's because their lives are so ruled by their transformations. It's more an involuntary reaction than a decision. Utterly unpredictable. And it changes everything about them. In that instant, when they shift from one form to the other, they don't really even exist. The future can't hold them. I listened to his musing in stony silence. I'll put your car back together in time for school, in case you'd like to drive yourself, he assured me after a minute. With my lips mashed together, I retrieved my keys and stiffly climbed out of the truck. Shut your window if you want me to stay away tonight. I'll understand, he whispered just before I slammed the door. I stomped into the house, slamming that door too. What's wrong? Charlie demanded from the couch. Truck won't start, I growled. You want me to look at it? No, I'll try in the morning. Want to use my car? I wasn't supposed to drive his police cruiser. Charlie must be really desperate to get me to the push. Nearly as desperate as I was. No, I'm tired, I grumbled. Night. I stamped my way up the stairs and went straight to my window. I shoved the metal frame roughly. It crashed shut, and the glass trembled. I stared at the shivering black glass for a long moment, until it was still. Then I sighed, and opened the window as wide as it would go. The sun was so deeply buried behind the clouds that there was no way to tell if it had set or not. After the long flight, chasing the sun westward so it seemed unmoving in the sky, it was especially disorienting. Time seemed oddly variable. It took me by surprise when the forest gave way to the first buildings, signaling that we were nearly home. You've been very quiet, Edward observed. Did the plane make you sick? No, I'm okay. Were you sad to leave? More relieved than sad, I think. He raised one eyebrow at me. I knew it was useless, and much as I hated to admit it, unnecessary to ask him to keep his eyes on the road. Renee is so much more perceptive than Charlie in some ways. It was making me jumpy. Edward laughed. Your mother has a very interesting mind. Almost childlike, but very insightful. She sees things differently than other people. Insightful. It was a good description of my mother, when she was paying attention. Most of the time Renee was so bewildered by her own life that she didn't notice much else. But this weekend she'd been paying plenty of attention to me. Phil was busy. The high school baseball team he coached was in the playoffs, and being alone with Edward and me had only sharpened Renee's focus. As soon as the hugs and squeals of delight were out of the way, Renee began to watch. And as she'd watched, her wide blue eyes had become first confused and then concerned. This morning, we'd gone for a walk along the beach. She wanted to show off all the beauties of her new home. still hoping, I think, that the sun might lure me away from Forks. She'd also wanted to talk with me alone, and that was easily arranged. Edward had fabricated a term paper to give himself an excuse to stay indoors during the day. In my head, I went through the conversation again. Renee and I ambled along the sidewalk, trying to stay in the range of the infrequent palm tree shadows. Though it was early, the heat was smothering. The air was so heavy with moisture that just breathing in and out was giving my lungs a workout. "Bella?" my mother asked, looking out past the sand to the lightly crashing waves as she spoke. "What is it, Mum?" She sighed, not meeting my gaze. "I'm worried." "What's wrong?" I asked, anxious at once. "What can I do?" "It's not me," she shook her head. "I'm worried about you and Edward." Renee finally looked at me when she said his name, her face apologetic. "Oh," I mumbled, fixing my eyes on a pair of joggers as they passed us, drenched with sweat. "You two are more serious than I'd been thinking," she went on. I frowned, quickly reviewing the last 2 days in my head. Edward and I had barely touched, in front of her at least. I wondered if Renee was about to give me a lecture on responsibility too. I didn't mind that the way I had with Charlie. It wasn't embarrassing with my mum. After all, I'd been the one giving her that lecture, time and time again, the last 10 years. "There's something strange about the way you two are together," she murmured, her forehead creasing over her troubled eyes. "The way he watches you, it's so protective. Like he's about to throw himself in front of a bullet to save you or something." I laughed, though I was still not able to meet her gaze. "That's a bad thing?" "No," she frowned as she struggled for the words. "It's just different. He's very intense about you, and very careful. I feel like I don't really understand your relationship, like there's some secret I'm missing." "I think you're imagining things, Mum," I said quickly, struggling to keep my voice light. There was a flutter in my stomach. I'd forgotten how much my mother saw. Something about her simple view of the world cut through all the distractions and pierced right to the truth of things. This had never been a problem before. Until now, there had never been a secret I couldn't tell her. "It's not just him," she set her lips defensively. "I wish you could see how you move around him." "What do you mean?" "The way you move, you orient yourself around him without even thinking about it. When he moves even a little bit, you adjust your position at the same time. Like magnets or gravity. You're like a satellite or something. I've never seen anything like it." She pursed her lips and stared down. "Don't tell me," I teased, forcing a smile. "You're reading mysteries again, aren't you? Or is it sci-fi this time?" Renee flushed a delicate pink. "That's beside the point. Found anything good?" "Well, there was one, but that doesn't matter. We're talking about you right now. You should stick to romance, Mum. You know how you freak yourself out." Her lips turned up at the corners. "I'm being silly, aren't I?" For half a second, I couldn't answer. Renee was so easily swayed. Sometimes it was a good thing, because not all her ideas were practical. But it pained me to see how quickly she caved in to my trivializing, especially since she was dead right this time. She looked up, and I controlled my expression. Not silly, just being a mum. She laughed and gestured grandly toward the white sand stretching to the blue water. And all this isn't enough to get you to move back in with your silly mum? I wiped my hand dramatically across my forehead and pretended to wring my hair out. You get used to the humidity, she promised. You can get used to rain too, I countered. She elbowed me playfully and took my hand as we walked back to her car. Other than her worries about me, she seemed happy enough, content. She still looked at Phil with goo-goo eyes, and that was comforting. Surely her life was full and satisfying. Surely she didn't miss me that much, even now. Edward's icy fingers brushed my cheek. I looked up, blinking, coming back to the present. He leaned down and kissed my forehead. We're home, sleeping beauty. Time to awake. We were stopped in front of Charlie's house. The porch light was on and the cruiser was parked in the driveway. As I examined the house, I saw the curtain twitch in the living room window, flashing a line of yellow light across the dark lawn. I sighed. Of course, Charlie was waiting to pounce. Edward must have been thinking the same thing, because his expression was stiff and his eyes remote as he came to get my door for me. How bad? I asked. Charlie's not going to be difficult, Edward promised, his voice level with no hint of humor. He missed you. My eyes narrowed in doubt. If that was the case, why was Edward tensed as if for battle? My bag was small, but he insisted on carrying it into the house. Charlie held the door open for us. "Welcome home, kid," Charlie shouted like he really meant it. How was Jacksonville? Moist and buggy. So Renee didn't sell you on the University of Florida. She tried, but I'd rather drink water than inhale it. Charlie's eyes flickered unwillingly to Edward. Did you have a nice time? Yes, Edward answered in a serene voice. Renee was very hospitable. That's, good. Glad you had fun. Charlie turned away from Edward and pulled me in for an unexpected hug. Impressive, I whispered in his ear. He rumbled a laugh. I really missed you, Bells. Food around here sucks when you're gone. I'll get on it, I said as he let me go. Would you call Jacob first? He's been bugging me every 5 minutes since 6 o'clock this morning. Promised I'd have you call him before you even unpacked. I didn't have to look at Edward to feel that he was too still, too cold beside me. So this was the cause of his tension. Jacob wants to talk to me? Pretty bad, I'd say. He wouldn't tell me what it was about, just said it was important. The phone rang then, shrill and demanding. That's him again. I bet my next paycheck, Charlie muttered. I got it. I hurried to the kitchen. Edward followed after me while Charlie disappeared into the living room. I grabbed the phone mid-ring, twisted around so I was facing the wall. Hello? You're back, Jacob said. His familiar husky voice sent a wave of wistfulness through me. 1,000 memories spun in my head, tangling together. A rocky beach strewn with driftwood trees. A garage made of plastic sheds. Warm sodas in a paper bag. A tiny room with one too small shabby love seat. The laughter in his deep-set black eyes. The feverish heat of his big hand around mine. The flash of his white teeth against his dark skin, his face stretching into the wide smile that had always been like a key to a secret door where only kindred spirits could enter. It felt sort of like homesickness, this longing for the place and person who had sheltered me through my darkest night. I cleared the lump from my throat. "Yes," I answered. "Why didn't you call me?" Jacob demanded. His angry tone instantly got my back up. "Because I've been in the house for exactly 4 seconds, and your call interrupted Charlie telling me you'd called." "Oh. Sorry." "Sure, now why are you harassing Charlie?" "I need to talk to you." "Yeah, I figured out that part all by myself. Go ahead." There was a short pause. "You going to school tomorrow?" I frowned to myself, unable to make sense of this question. "Of course I am. Why wouldn't I?" "I don't know, just curious." Another pause. "So what did you want to talk about, Jake?" He hesitated. "Nothing, really. I guess I wanted to hear your voice." "Yeah, I know. I'm so glad you called me, Jake. But I didn't know what more to say. I wanted to tell him I was on my way to La Push right now, and I couldn't tell him that." "I have to go," he said abruptly. "What?" "I'll talk to you soon, okay? But Jake..." He was already gone. I listened to the dial tone with disbelief. "That was short," I muttered. "Is everything all right?" Edward asked. His voice was low and careful. I turned slowly to face him. His expression was perfectly smooth, impossible to read. "I don't know. I wonder what that was about." It didn't make sense that Jacob had been hounding Charlie all day just to ask me if I was going to school. If he'd wanted to hear my voice, then why did he hang up so quickly? "Your guess is probably better than mine," Edward said, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I murmured. That was true. I knew Jake inside and out. It shouldn't be that complicated to figure out his motivations. With my thoughts miles away, about 15 miles away, up the road to the push, I started combing through the fridge, assembling ingredients for Charlie's dinner. Edward leaned against the counter, and I was distantly aware that his eyes were on my face, but too preoccupied to worry about what he saw there. The school thing seemed like the key to me. That was the only real question Jake had asked. And he had to be after an answer to something, or he wouldn't have been bugging Charlie so persistently. Why would my attendance record matter to him, though? I tried to think about it in a logical way. If I hadn't been going to school tomorrow, what would be the problem with that, from Jacob's perspective? Charlie had given me a little grief about missing a day of school so close to finals. I'd convinced him that one Friday wasn't going to derail my studies. Jake would hardly care about that. My brain refused to come up with any brilliant insights. Maybe I was missing some vital piece of information. What could have changed in the past 3 days that was so important that Jacob would break his long streak of refusing to answer my phone calls and contact me? What difference could 3 days make? I froze in the middle of the kitchen. The package of icy hamburgers in my hand slipped through my numb fingers. It took me a slow second to miss the thud it should have made against the floor. Edward had caught it and thrown it onto the counter. His arms were already around me. his lips at my ear. "What's wrong?" I shook my head, dazed. 3 days could change everything. Hadn't I just been thinking about how impossible college was? How I couldn't be anywhere near people after I'd gone through a painful 3-day conversion that would set me free from mortality so that I could spend eternity with Edward. The conversion that would make me forever a prisoner to my own thirst. Had Charlie told Billy that I'd vanished for 3 days? Had Billy jumped to conclusions? Had Jacob really been asking me if I was still human? Making sure the werewolves' treaty was unbroken? That none of the Cullens had dared to bite a human? Bite, not kill. But did he honestly think I would come home to Charlie if that was the case? Edward shook me. "Bella?" he asked, truly anxious now. I think he was checking," I mumbled. "Checking to make sure that I'm human, I mean." Edward stiffened. A low hiss sounded in my ears. "We'll have to leave," I whispered. "Before, so that it doesn't break the treaty. We won't ever be able to come back." His arms tightened around me. "I know." Charlie cleared his voice loudly behind us. I jumped and pulled free of Edward's arms, my face getting hot. Edward leaned back against the counter. His eyes were tight. I could see worry in them, and anger. "If you don't want to make dinner, I can call for a pizza," Charlie hinted. "No, it's okay. I'm already started." "Okay," Charlie said. He propped himself against the doorframe, folding his arms. I sighed and got to work, trying to ignore my audience. "If I asked you to do something, would you trust me?" Edward asked, an edge to his soft voice. We were almost to school. Edward had been relaxed and joking just a moment ago, and now suddenly his hands were clenched tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles straining in an effort not to snap it into pieces. I stared at his anxious expression. His eyes were far away, like he was listening to distant voices. My pulse sped in response to his stress, but I answered carefully. "That depends." We pulled into the school lot. "I was afraid you would say that." "What do you want me to do, Edward?" "I want you to stay in the car." He pulled into his usual spot and turned the engine off as he spoke. "I want you to wait here until I come back for you." "But why?" That was when I saw him. He would have been hard to miss, towering over the students the way he did, even if he hadn't been leaning against his black motorcycle, parked illegally on the sidewalk. "Oh." Jacob's face was a calm mask that I recognized well. It was the face he used when he was determined to keep his emotions in check, to keep himself under control. It made him look like Sam, the oldest of the wolves, the leader of the Quiyu pack. But Jacob could never quite manage the perfect serenity that Sam always exuded. I'd forgotten how much this face bothered me. Though I'd gotten to know Sam pretty well before the Cullens had come back, to like him even, I'd never been able to completely shake the resentment I felt when Jacob mimicked Sam's expression. It was a stranger's face. He wasn't my Jacob when he wore it. "You jumped to the wrong conclusion last night," Edward murmured. He asked about school. because he knew that I would be where you were. He was looking for a safe place to talk to me, a place with witnesses. So I'd misinterpreted Jacob's motives last night. Missing information, that was the problem. Information like why in the world Jacob would want to talk to Edward. "I'm not staying in the car," I said. Edward groaned quietly. "Of course not. Well, let's get this over with." Jacob's face hardened as we walked toward him, hand in hand. And that is where we close the book tonight, on this episode of Down to Sleep and on this week's reading of Eclipse. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you're enjoying this reading as much as you've enjoyed the previous two. Personally, I think this one is off to a stronger start than New Moon. I did really enjoy New Moon, but this one feels more like the first book in some ways, like the best parts of the first book. But we'll see how things shake out. It's my first time experiencing the saga, so we shall see. For now, I thank you for supporting the podcast, and I hope that you manage to get the rest that you deserve tonight. Until next time, thank you, and good night.